We're going to have a very interesting fireside chat with Alexandra, please. Software engineer at Segment. Thank you. I'll let you introduce yourself.
First of all, Marco, thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be at Kong speaking about this. I'm Alex, and I'm a software engineer for Segment. And Segment provides customer data infrastructure. And basically what that means is we have a single API that our customers send first-party data to. And from there, we fan that data out to hundreds of different email marketing analytics tools. And this data comes from websites, mobile apps, and is usually events that our customers are monitoring, such as page views, abandoning cart, app installs. When Segment first started, our architecture was really simple. We had a single API. That API forwarded data to a queue, and then that queue, at the end of it, there was one monolith that ingested these events and sent them to all of our downstream, what we call destinations, which are our marketing tools. But as time went on, we experienced some performance issues with that setup, so we broke up all of those destinations into microservices. And for a time, that worked for us. But as we found, and I wrote a post about this, is that the setup actually became too much for the dev team working on these hundreds of microservices, so we moved back to a monolith. And at Segment, we still use microservices pretty heavily throughout all of our infrastructure, but we found that in this one particular place, a monolith was actually the best setup for us. And so when I joined the team, I was working on these microservices. And then I helped with the transition back to a monolith and have been helping maintain and monitor the monolith since.
This is a very unique story in the industry, right? From Monolith, services, and back. So when you made the first transition to microservices, what lessons did you learn in breaking down that monolith?
Yeah, so the lessons we learned there was that it's really all about finding what works for you and your team at the time. I think if Segment had started with the microservice architecture, we would have struggled to get off the ground because our dev team would have been too small to handle that operational overhead that the microservices would have had on the team. And so it's really all about weighing the trade-offs between a microservice and a monolithic architecture and deciding what's best for you and your dev team at that time and like where you are in the industry, how big your team is, and like what your infrastructure looks like at the time. So I think that was a lesson we learned, was to not get stuck in one type of architecture, and it's okay to switch between the two as long as you know the trade-offs and have a good story around each trade-off.
And so in a microservice, so after breaking down the monolith, and then you guys transitioned to microservices, what were the main factors that really made you reconsider that microservice-oriented architectures? So what happened?
So we had our microservice set up for about 2 years. And as time went on, the team stayed around 3 engineers. And the main motivation for us to move away from microservices was the burden that was on the dev team to maintain these microservices. Because for us, a new partner, a new tool meant a brand new service. And ideally, we'd want to be adding hundreds of these services to our platform, but then that meant hundreds of new services, and you can't have a team of 3 maintaining hundreds of services. The operational overhead was just too much on the team. So the biggest factor was alleviating the dev team that was working on these microservices. And then the secondary to that was we were experiencing some performance issues actually with the microservices. The biggest one was that some of our more popular destinations, they would be processing hundreds of thousands of events per second, while the smaller ones were only processing a handful a day. And we were constantly getting paged to have to go in and scale up the smaller microservices anytime there was a slight increase in load, because you can't scale. There's no set of auto-scaling rules that allows you to adjust to sharp increases in load, unless you over-provision your infrastructure, but then that gets really expensive. So we were sick of having to constantly go in, getting paged in the middle of the night, having to scale these services up. And also, each service had a radically distinct load pattern in terms of the amount of memory and CPU that they used. So we found that there was no set of auto-scaling rules that we could blanket apply to all of these services. And we were constantly spending time tweaking these services to try and find the right set of auto-scaling rules. And when you move back to a monolith, it can easily absorb spikes and loads. And then you also get a really good blend of CPU and memory-intensive integrations or destinations on our side. So it's able to scale. We can set scaling rules on CPU, and so then the dev team is no longer getting paged at night. So it was really, the main focus was on the team that was maintaining and monitoring these services. And then we were able to kind of kill two birds with one stone and alleviate some of the performance issues we saw with scaling too.
And this really reconnects with the idea that, whatever makes business sense, really, right? It's not
Exactly.
adopting technology for the sake of adopting technology. It's experimenting, playing with it, and, picking the right architecture at the end of the day, right?
Exactly. It's all about what's best for you and your team at that time. Like I mentioned before, I don't think Segment would have been able to get off the ground if we initially started with hundreds of microservices. Starting in the monolith allowed us to move quickly, and then that didn't work for a time, so we moved to microservices. And then after a few years of that, we were no longer able to make headway, and the team was just struggling keeping the system alive with hundreds of microservices. So we moved back to a monolith, and now we've been able to make headway again. And even in some parts of our infrastructure, we're actually moving to a monolith, but I would say on the whole, for other teams, microservices work great for them. Even within Segment, we still heavily use microservices.
So how was the process of breaking down the monolith different from the process of consolidating microservices?
Yeah, so there's 3 different things that were different with all of those. The first was that dependency management. When you break apart a monolith, now obviously every service has their own set of dependencies, so you don't really have to worry about that. But when you go back to the monolith, then it becomes an issue. We had to spend, my team and I, with outside resources, I think about a week converging everything back, because now they have one shared set of dependencies, and so we would have to go through, test, see what would break with newer versions of dependencies, and fix that. That took us about a week. The second is the story around testing. So one of the original motivations, too, for us to break apart the monolith was that the tests were flaky and constantly broken, so it prevented the team from deploying, which was really frustrating. So we broke everything apart into its separate repo. Now one test was isolated from another destination's test, so we could move quickly and deploy these services. But when we moved back, we almost had to relax our testing a little bit to prevent ourselves from being in the same situation we were in the first place, where one flaky test could prevent the whole thing from breaking. So we actually built a custom traffic recorder to allow us to have more stable testing so that we weren't constantly blocked on this being broken. And then the third would be, let's see, I can't remember. I think those are the main 2, actually.
And so how long did it take to actually break down the monolith, and then how long did it take to put it back together? I assume, by the way, that the resulting monolith at the end of this transition wasn't the same. It's not the same as the one you started with, right?
Yes, exactly. So what we started with, again, was a single API that forward events to a single queue, and then a single service at the end. And when we broke everything up into separate microservices, we actually gave each microservice its own queue as well. And that was a natural transition for us. We were like, OK, this will be easy, one queue, now move to multiple queues. But going back, we had to rethink that queuing system completely and start over, because we couldn't have separate queues with one monoservice at the end consuming from a bunch of separate queues. We didn't want to go back to one queue, because we would have been in the same exact position we were in the first place. And so we had to completely rethink how to feed events into this service. And that's where we came up with the design for Centrifuge, which is a project that we built and have been working on for months. So that took us, I think, 9 months to build Centrifuge, which has allowed us to then move back to the monolith a second time.
So from a technical standpoint, when you broke down the monolith the first time into microservices, was that a gradual transition, or was that effectively starting a separate code base? What kind of strategy, I'm hinting at, what kind of strategy did you use when you broke down the monolith in the first place?
When we broke down the monolith in the first place, it wasn't a gradual thing. We first broke, everything still lived in one repo. We first broke up everything into its own service with everything in one repo still. And that didn't take it was a quick transition. It didn't take very long. There wasn't really a good way for us to break up that work. And then after a couple months, we were getting blocked by this flaky test. So we broke everything up into a single repo. And that also, we just kind of war roomed and did everything at once. So the breaking apart didn't take very long. It was putting everything back together because we had to rebuild and rethink the entire queuing system. That took, like, I'd say 9 months to put everything back into one. It was a lot trickier.
That was on when you went back to the monolith.
Yes, exactly. It was much trickier. I think it took us a year fully of planning and then rewriting this new queuing system and then moving everything back to the monolith.
More complicated to put things back and break them apart.
Just a little bit. Right? We were also a much bigger company, so customers cared more when there was delays and.
Oh, definitely.
So it was a little more difficult. We had to be more cognizant of that the second time around.
Which is actually a very important topic. You know, all of these technical transitions, they somewhat impact how we run our product, and they may have consequences in the way our customers then, use the product if it's not done right.
Exactly. So for us, when we were migrating everything back over, we did it really slowly. We started with a bunch of our smaller, less used destinations and moved them over, and then slowly would add the higher traffic ones. But as we were doing that, we would find bottlenecks in the system and have to roll it back to the old system, spend a time weeks fixing those bottlenecks, and then we could move over to slowly add more traffic to this new system. And we had a really robust QA system as well that we built in-house to verify that everything was happening exactly as we expected.
And this is great because really breaking down a monolith or putting a monolith back together, it's effectively some sort of refactoring of your code base. And there can't be good and successful refactoring if we don't have a good test suite in place.
Yes, exactly. Lots of refactoring. It's funny, we refactored it, and now we're even looking into a place like, do we need to refactor this a little bit again? But it was nice to be able to start from scratch and refactor a bunch of the core business logic that was shared between all of the microservices when we moved to Monolith, because now it all lived in one place. So that was really nice to do as well, yeah.
And this is one, usually, I believe it's one of the requirements that every organization should consider and have in mind when approaching any sort of transition. I speak with lots of enterprise organizations that are like, Marco, we would like to break down, blow up the monolith, perhaps transition to serverless, to microservices. And the first question I ask them is, do you have a test suite in place? Because if you don't, this is not going to end up well.
Exactly.
It is a requirement, I would say.
Totally. I completely agree. Yeah, our QA system took us months to build, but it was completely necessary for what we wanted to do because this is our core product. It was our most used product. So if we weren't QAing the issues, our customers were definitely going to find them before we did. So we heavily invested in that the second time around when moving back.
And so just to get this right, do you run just a monolith now, or do you still have some microservice-oriented applications that running perhaps alongside, the monolith?
Yeah, we actually are still very heavily favor microservices within Segment. It's just in this one particular product, which happens to be our largest, most used product, that we've moved back to the monolith. But throughout Segment, we still love and use microservices.
You're effectively hybrid architectures.
Exactly.
In a hybrid world. Yes. Yesterday I was mentioning that the industry, it's a little bit tribal. There is some tribalism in the industry when it comes to programming languages, when it comes to architectures, when it comes to it's either one or the other. It's very polarizing. The truth is always, as usual, in the middle, right? It's hybrid, using what makes more sense.
Exactly. And some of our teams have found that they're also transitioning to a monolith for different reasons than we did. One big effort we're going through right now is cost savings, and microservices are expensive to run because there's a lot more operational overhead. So moving back to a monolith has allowed those teams to actually save in infrastructure costs as well. So it's not just our team that do it, but there's different motivations behind it than they had for us.
So what features of a monolith could indicate that it's not really a good candidate to be, broken apart?
I think there's a lot of things that go into that. The first is something that kind of bit us was if your core business logic starts to eclipse that of the individual service, then you're going to be stuck in a position where we were, where whenever you update that core business logic, you're going to have to redeploy, test, and update every single one of those microservices. Another is cost, which I just talked about. Running microservices can be more expensive than a monolith. One is your team ready to take on the operational overhead that comes with microservices? With a monolith, it's one thing you have to deploy, one thing to test. With microservices, there's a lot of other aspects to it, and there's obviously more of them. Fault isolation, that was a trade-off that we had to kind of have a good story around, because when everything's in a monolith, you might have to do some extra work to get fault isolation, and it's not a hard isolation like it is with microservices that you basically get for free. So if that is something that is necessary, then maybe microservices are right for you or not. And then I think those are the main things to consider. Another thing actually would be, if you have one team that's maintaining this, it might not be best to break it apart. If it's then that same team is maintaining those same services, if you're in a position like where you can scale these services infinitely, that's probably not the best candidate as well, because again, you can't have a team of 3 to 5 engineers maintaining hundreds of microservices. There's just, the operation overhead gets to be too much.
And as you're going through these steps, right? You're telling us your story and segment story. One of the words that you keep saying, it's the team operations. It's not just about technology, isn't it?
Yeah, not at all. There were definitely some performance issues that we wanted to tackle. Like, for example, the original reason we broke everything up into microservices is because we were experiencing head-of-line blocking, which was pretty frustrating for the team. And so that was the main motivation originally. But the major focus of moving back to a monolith was the dev team and their sanity and being able to make headway and not just drown, just trying to keep the system alive, which is what ended up happening to us.
So you wrote a blog post that got lots of traction in the community.
Yes.
And Segment, again, in an industry that's really trying to push for different architectural patterns, that's very tribal still when it comes to architectures. It's going to change, but it's still very tribal. In an industry that's pushing towards microservices, that's pushing away from the monolith, effectively, your story and Segment's story was one of the few ones that was going on the other side.
Yes.
Right? And what kind of reactions did you get from that?
It caused quite a stir on Hacker News. I will be honest, I didn't actually read any of the comments. When I published the post, I told myself I was going to read them in a couple days, because maybe if we were lucky, we would get 50 comments. But it ended up actually getting over 700.
Was there any comment in particular that you remember you want to bring up? Or any topic that was brought up?
Yeah, I think some people thought that maybe us moving to microservices in the first place was a little premature, and that we should have thought more at the time about why we made that decision. But from some of the press that I've talked to and people reaching out, it's been pretty positive. People are really just curious why we did that, because as you mentioned, it is kind of the reverse trend of what everyone else is doing. So people have reached out, really wanting to know more about what was our decisions behind it. Are they about to make the same mistakes? And I think that microservices is definitely, Silicon Valley loves microservices. Like I said, at Segment, we still use them, love them. But I think in the industry as a whole, it's actually still up for debate on what is the right approach for everyone.
That is very true. It's a pattern. It's an interface almost, right? And there are different implementations that one can go for when it comes to that. I mean, Segment, you have built most of your infrastructure around the concept of events, right?
Exactly.
So event-based microservices, and this is something that we just brought up with Neha just before. It's something that perhaps it's not. I don't come across as often as service-to-service communication. Different implementations for the pattern.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about, again, finding the right team, finding the right fit for your team and your infrastructure at the time, and what makes sense. And that could change. I mean, it did for us twice already. We've gone monolith microservices back to monolith, and who knows, it could change again in the future.
So what advice would you give to any team that's either considering moving to microservices or perhaps moving back to monoliths?
I would say know the trade-offs and know them well, and make a decision, have a good story around each of the trade-offs when thinking about a microservice and a monolithic architecture. And again, deciding are you comfortable with the trade-offs that come with each, and what is going to work best for your team at that time and your architecture at the time. I think a lot of people fall guilty in trying to future-proof their systems, but I think you should really make the decision based on your current team and your current setup and your infrastructure, and know each of the trade-offs well that come with the different approaches.
That was good. Thank you.
No problem.
Is there any questions from the audience? I believe we have the box. Everybody can hear.
Is this on? This is on. Perfect. Could you elaborate a bit on the centrifuge bit you were talking about?
Oh, sure. So Centrifuge, so now how our system looks is we have still the same single API that's ingest events. And then we have a router at the front, and the router will look at, OK, this event needs to go to these 5 destinations. It'll make a copy of that event and then send it on to Centrifuge, each one of those copies. And then Centrifuge is actually with distributed databases, and Centrifuge is responsible for setting priority on that event and then feeding it into the Mono service. We have a blog post on it, and I would be more than happy to get into the details with you on it at lunch. But basically, we don't have queues anymore. It's like this big rotating databases that we have that are storing these events and like knowing when to send the events onto the Mono service. Because one of the features of Segment is that if an event fails, depending on why it failed, we want to resend that event later. So like 500s, rate limiting, we know we can maybe get it to the destination later for our customers, and Centrifuge keeps track of all of that for us. Versus in a queue, everything was just in line, so we had to completely scrap that and rewrite it.
Perhaps you should open source it.
There have been talks.
I'm pretty sure.
We love open source, so it's just not quite ready yet.
Any other question? Opa.
All right. Hi. Nice talk, nice discussion. Thank you for that. I have one question about more towards the organization side of things when it comes to microservices, where a lot of our industry leaders have advised that break down into microservices when your team starts to grow and when a monolith is being developed by a large team and you want to break down your team, then you should break down your microservice. So in your experience, it seems like you also tried the same thing where a single team was running multiple microservices. So was that something before this realization that the industry had that don't do microservices like just breaking it down and then running? So what advice do you have with that, like organization side of things?
I think that one thing that you need to consider when breaking this down into microservices is how easy it is to spin up one of those new microservices. For us, it involved a new queue, a new repo, new Terraform config, new infrastructure on AWS, and it wasn't actually easy for us to spin these up quickly and move as fast as we need. So I think that that is a huge consideration to take into effect when thinking about that type of stuff, is what is the overhead on getting set up with a new service? Because within a monolith, it's super easy for us now. But before, it was a huge pain.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Of course. Thank you.